continuing with our data entry, there is not any information on control equipment on the fee form. So I'm assuming that there is not any control equipment at the facility, but you should confirm with the facility about that. But we're going to go on and we're going to enter the process information. So we'll click on processes and we will click add. So we can add the process for unit identifier T1. By default, TEISS just takes our emission unit data and puts it in here. But we don't want that. We're going to enter something else. We're going to follow our 01, 02, 03 identifying system, and we're going to change this process description. Get this out of here. We're going to change it to something that's a little more descriptive. We know that this is natural gas combustion that's causing these emissions, so we're going to enter that into our description. And then we're going to search for our SCC. So we know that natural gas combustion is what's going on to make these emissions. So let's give natural gas a try for search. And click enter to do that search. And so we've got some options here. We've got external combustion boilers, industrial natural gas. That could be. But let's scroll to the right a little bit and see what we have here. I'm not so sure. Let's just keep looking and make sure there's not something else that I'm... Internal combustion engines. Maybe it's an internal combustion engine. And you can talk to the facility and ask them about this, or it might be something that's in the fee form that you found. But let's take a look at natural gas, industrial natural gas, and scroll to the right and see what options we have here. So you'll see at the very top there's a turbine. So that looks like that's probably it. That's the SCC I want to assign. And if you're really struggling with these SCCs, don't get frustrated. Just contact us, because I have gotten a lot of experience working with SCCs, and I know a lot of the SCCs and what should go with what. So just give us a call or email us, and we'll be more than happy to help you out to assign the correct SCC. But this is the one we want. So we'll go ahead and click OK. And let's see if there's anything else we need to enter here. No, looks good. We'll click OK, and that will save the data. And the next thing was we're going to scroll down and see what we need to enter next. That's the release point apportionment. So we'll click on that and click Add. And there's only one release point that we have currently assigned to this facility, and that's going to be that fugitive release point. So we're going to select that identifier of 01. And TEISS nicely puts 100% in here by default, so we can leave that alone. And see if there's anything else. Nope. So we'll click OK to save this data. Now we're going to enter reporting period data, since we actually have emissions on the fee form that we want to enter. So we'll scroll down until we find reporting period. And we will click Add. And that brings up the reporting period data entry screen. So by default, the reporting period type code is set as annual, and that's what we want, because we have annual emissions, which means we have emissions for the entire year. So the only thing we have to enter here is the emission operating type code, and that's routine. I bet that R stands for routine, but let me make sure by scrolling to the right. Yep, that's what it is. So we will go ahead and select that and see if we have anything else here. Throughput data is optional for point sources, so we don't need to enter any throughput data for point sources. And we will click OK. Now, had we not had our emissions in our fee form, we could use the estimate button to open up a calculator in TEISS to calculate those emissions if we have the throughput data. we don't have throughput data. What we have is the actual emissions data in that table 4 in the fee form. So we want to enter the actual emissions. Usually, this is only something you would do for point sources. Usually for non-point sources, you would use the TEISS calculator to estimate your emissions. But for point sources, you might actually enter them from a fee form or some other form you got from the facility, because oftentimes facilities have their own emissions recorded somewhere. So we'll click on actual emissions, and we will click add. Now let's take a look at the fee form and see what we're going to be adding. So for unit T1, we've got Nox emissions, VOC emissions, and CH2O emissions, which I happen to know is formaldehyde emissions. If you didn't know that, you could easily do a web search on what is CH2O, and you would easily find that that's formaldehyde emissions. So we'll start by entering our Nox emissions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same technique of copying and pasting, because that is going to decrease our transcription errors if we copy and paste, hopefully. So I will click Control-C on my keyboard to copy that value. Now, I'll go ahead and select my pollutant code of Nox. And in my version of TEISS, I've got my criteria pollutants set up to be shown on the top of my screen, because that's how they're sorted. If you don't see Nox immediately, then you could do a text-to-search option. But I'm going to go ahead and click Nox and click Select. And then I'm going to go ahead and paste in my total emissions from my fee form by doing Control-V on my keyboard. Emission unit of measure code, let's double check. It's very important. It's the most important thing that you're going to enter, because 42.4 means nothing unless it has the correct emission units associated with it. So let's make sure. Okay, TPY, that's tons per year. And you also notice it says to the nearest ton here. So these emissions are in ton. So we can go ahead and click the dots and find tons here. And I double clicked on that to enter it into my TEISS project. The emission calculation method code means what method did they use to estimate these emissions. There was nothing in the fee form that told me what method they used, and I'm not really sure. So I'm going to go ahead and click other emission factor, because I'm not really sure what they used. And click select. Sometimes it will say in the fee form, it will say AP42 methods or something like that. And if that was the case, you would know that it was US EPA emission factor. So you can use that as the emission calculation method code. But I'm just going to use 13 for other emission factors. And click select. And nothing else I need to enter here. And click OK. Okay, so that's the Nox emissions. Let's see, what I'm going to enter next is the VOC emissions. So I'll copy these, Control-C on my keyboard, and go into TEISS. And we're adding another emissions to this unit. So look into it in our breadcrumb panel. We'll see we're still in the emission unit T1, and we're still in that process. So we'll click Add. And we'll click VOCs, and we will paste in by doing Control-V. And our unit of measure code is tons. And our emission calculation method code, again, we don't know, so we'll use other. And click select, click OK. And let's see, next is the formaldehyde emissions. So we will do Control-C to copy those. And go back into TEISS. We'll click Add. Pollutant code. Since this is a path, it's not immediately showing up on my screen, so I'm going to do a text to search. And click on the binoculars. And you'll notice here that the pollutant code comes up as being a number, so perhaps the pollutant code is usually a number. So we'll click select, and we'll go ahead and do a Control-V on our keyboard to paste that data in. And emission unit of measure code is tons. Select. We don't know the method code here, so we're going to select other. Select that, and click OK to save that data. So this completes the data entry for the first emission unit in that table. So let's take a look at that table again. So we've got, let's see, a couple more emission units to enter. And you'll notice that T2 is also a turbine. So it'd be very beneficial to go ahead and clone the first turbine and paste it in, because we don't need to re-enter all this stuff for the turbine. Since all of the things are going to be very similar, it's going to have the same SEC, it's going to have the same release point, etc., etc. So we will clone T1. So to clone, we go back to the emission unit. And we click on the copy selected entities with children. And now we will paste with the paste button. Also, make sure when you click copy selected entities, make sure this is selected, it's in dark blue. Then click paste. So it comes in as some default unit identifier. So let's change that by clicking edit. We will change the unit identifier T2. And let's take a look at that table again. So there's a slight change in the description. You'll notice here that this is T5500 and this is T5700. So I'm just going to copy this description in just so I have the right description in there. So I'll highlight it, click Control-C, and go back into TEISS. And we'll highlight this. Actually, I'm going to delete it first because I don't know. I can't tell if it's all highlighted or what. So now it's completely gone. And then I'll do Control-V to paste that in. So now we've got the new description in, and everything else is the same. So all we've got to do is click OK. So since we copied this when it had emissions already entered, those emissions for unit T1 were copied for unit T2. So what we have to do is we've got to go into the emissions for T2 and change those. So to do that, you want to make sure that the emission unit of TU is selected, and then we're going to go down to actual emissions. Okay, so you'll notice that these are exactly the same as for T1, and that's not right according to Table 4. So we've got to go through and edit these and fix them. Before you edit anything, make sure that you are in the right emission unit. You're changing the data for T2. Make sure you're not still in T1. So look at the breadcrumb panel, make sure you're in T2. So we're going to start with nitrogen oxide, and we're going to change that value from 42.4, and we're going to change that to the value in the table. So let's take a look at the table. The table value is 58.9. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy it, Control-C on my keyboard, go back into TEISS, click Edit. With nitrogen oxide selected, click Edit. Now we're going to change that 42.4. We're just going to highlight it. And we're just going to press Control-V on our keyboard. Make sure it's highlighted before you do that. 58.9 is what we want, and we'll click OK. So notice that changes that value right here. We've got to change our other two pollutants. So we need to change VOC to 6. So we'll do a Control-C. Go into TEISS, find our VOC emissions, click Edit. I'm going to highlight the total emissions of 4.6, and we're going to do a Control V. Now, you don't have to use this cut and paste option. If you don't want to, you can totally hand enter these if you would rather do that. I'm just giving you the option because it seems like it's easier to me. So we will click OK to save that. And we've got one more emissions to change, and that's the formaldehyde. So let's take a look at our fee form. Formaldehyde emissions are 0.5. Do Control C. Go back into TEISS. Select formaldehyde and select Edit. And we'll highlight them. Control V and click OK. That saves those emissions. And so that completes our T2 data entry. And now I totally recommend that you take a look at the data you've entered and do a QA/QC check at this point. So make sure, let's go back to the emission unit T1, and all we have to do is click in the breadcrumb panel and click prior. That's going to go back to the previous emission unit. So look at these and compare them to the table in the fee form. Make sure they're correct. It's easy to make errors when you cut and paste. It's just something that might happen. So you want to make sure you do your QA/QC at this point because you don't want errors in your data. That shows you how to enter those two units. I'm going to go back to the fee form for a second and take a look at these other units. So we've got two heaters, we've got a vent, and we've got some kind of flare. So if I was to enter these data into my TEISS project, I wouldn't clone my turbines because the turbine is different from the heater. And there would be a lot of things I need to change about it. So it'd probably be easier just to enter it from scratch. But I'm not going to go through that process because it's very similar to entering the turbine data. But once you enter that first heater, then you can clone it and enter the second heater. And for the vent and the plant flare, those are really different again. So I would enter those by scratch instead of doing a cloning on those. And that concludes this demonstration.